Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I am great and feeling great after a terrific gala.
It was fantastic, and we're still basking from the glow of our annual Sir Anthony Fisher Gala, which is what we call our Northern California Gala. This year, we had it at Silicon Valley, and our keynote speaker was none other than the famous historian, very prominent scholar, Neil Ferguson. It was especially prescient now that Israel is at war. We have an upcoming presidential election, the divisiveness of our politics these days. I thought he gave a really excellent perspective.
Well, I think especially too, you never know how events are going to take shape before our galas. And, it used to be always terrific when we would have the late Charles Krauthammer as our gala speaker. We would always have him right after the election. And people were so excited to hear what he had to say about the issue. And I think when events sadly took shape in the Middle East, my first thought was, boy, I can't wait to hear what he has to say. And certainly we were not disappointed. It couldn't have been a more topical and interesting discussion for the times that we're facing today.
And, Tim, I thought we had a brilliant person to do the interview and hold the conversation as well, Peter Robinson. And I thought he brought out the best in Neil Ferguson. They were good friends. They are good friends. Peter's also a Hoover scholar and a former Reagan speechwriter who wrote the Tear Down This Wall speech. So I thought he asked very insightful questions from Neil.
Yes, I agree. And of course, we kicked off the evening with the presentation of the Toby Family Freedom Prize. And I couldn't think of a more deserving honoree than our Dan Kolke, who is a PRI board member, the chair of our California Reform Committee. If you think about, kind of key California public policy issues of the last couple of decades, you may not realize it, but Dan really played a very instrumental role on the legal side of things, especially on things like redistricting and tribal gaming and, all the changes surrounding the initiative process. Dan really has, been at the heart of those efforts and successfully at the heart of those efforts on behalf of the conservative cause. So a terrific honoree, and, he gave a very great and strong defense of Israel at the beginning of his presentation. And that was, of course, so important, getting the Toby Family Prize, presented by Tad Toby, who is really, if you think about people who have been strong allies and important American supporters of the cause, really it's been Tad Toby. So very well-deserving award, very interesting remarks that he gave, and really kicked off the evening on a high note, I thought.
Yeah, and it was really great for the Governor Pete Wilson, to send over a video. He was actually traveling. His wife, Gail Wilson, was also receiving an award. So he sent over this fantastic introduction where he recounts some of the work that Dan had done for him and for California over the years, especially when he was governor. Finally, Tim, I had a really fun table. Steve Hilton and his wife, Rachel Whetstone. Rachel Whetstone is a granddaughter of our founder, Sir Anthony Fisher. John Yoo was at my table. It was really a lot of fun. Judge Janice Rogers Brown, she led the pledge. And, for those who didn't attend, I got to say, we couldn't record it. The keynote address couldn't be taped. So folks, you'll just have to come to our galas going forward.
When we say, you're going to have a great time coming to a PRI gala, we really mean it. So for those of you who weren't there, you really did miss out. So this week on our podcast, we have Emily Hoeven, who is a new political columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. She's been there about a year or so now. She came over from CalMatters, where she wrote the popular WhatMatters column, which was kind of the way to start your day every morning in your inbox with the, with her take on all the political goings on in Sacramento and around the state. And Emily really is a breath of fresh air. Agree with her or not in her takes on things, but she really has the pulse of what's going on in San Francisco, Francisco, in the Bay Area, and in Sacramento. She's really making a name for herself with her terrific new column. And so we talk with her about kind of all the hot issues that we're all dealing with in California these days and get her perspective of what's going on in San Francisco and Sacramento. So I think you'll all really enjoy what Emily has to say.
Yeah, Tim, I was really impressed by Emily. I thought she gave excellent answers to all of our questions. And I got to say, it's probably one of the top 10 interviews we've done this year.
No, I agree. So if you're interested in all of these issues, crime, homelessness, what's going on with Gavin Newsom, what's going on with Senator Butler and the legacy of Senator Feinstein, all these sorts of things that are in the news and continue to be, this is the episode for you. You're going to get an incredible firsthand perspective.
So thanks so much for listening. And here's Emily Hoeven. Emily, we're delighted to have you on to discuss some of the things you've been writing about in your terrific column. But before we get into politics and policy, let's talk about you. For our listeners who may not be following you, you transitioned earlier this year from writing a daily political newsletter for CalMatters to becoming an opinion columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. So how have you found the shift? And what are some of the things you like most about being an opinion columnist?
Yeah, well, thank you both so much for having me on. I'm excited to talk with you. And yeah, the shift has been good. I think that working for 3 years at CalMatters, where, as you said, I was doing a daily newsletter on state policy and politics, it really primed me to go in a lot of different directions, because when you are following all the ins and outs of the Capitol and the legislative process and the governor, day in and day out, you really get a feel for the issues that are, the most important, that keep coming up, that are the most controversial. And you get a pretty good background in issues ranging from climate to criminal justice. And it just made me feel positioned to write authoritatively about a lot of these different subjects. And I always wanted to get back into opinion writing. I did opinion writing when I was in high school and in college. And I just love that ability to inject voice into my work and have a bit more of a direct connection with readers, getting both good and bad responses, just being able to have that dialogue and have that conversation. And I think as well for me, when I was covering the Capitol in the newsletter, it got to the point where, I wanted to not only relay what was going on, but I wanted to say what I thought about it, whether it was good or bad or a little bit of both, and be able to try to just inflect and affect policy by just kind of pointing out things that had become apparent to me in my past role at CalMatters. And so I really enjoyed the transition to the Chronicle, and also learning how to kind of make some of the issues in Sacramento salient for a Bay Area audience. Although I will say as well, San Francisco is sort of like the test case of California in a lot of ways, in a lot of different policy areas. And so I find that the vast majority of what comes out of Sacramento is important for San Franciscans and people in the Bay Area to understand. And also sometimes what Sacramento does is shaped by San Francisco and vice versa. So it's been really, really interesting. So
let's talk about some of the great things you're writing about these days. And the biggest news, of course, recently in California has been the sad and untimely death of Senator Dianne Feinstein and her replacement with our new Senator LaFonza Butler. Now, it would seem that Governor Newsom would get a lot of widespread praise from his core constituencies for his pick, but yet, as you write, it was a, quote, highlight reel of his political flaws. So, in your view, how did a governor with so many obvious political talents really make such a mess of what should have been a slam dunk political win for him?
Yeah, I think that entire process surrounding the appointment just kind of highlighted some of the things that the governor struggles with, which in my mind are sort of being impulsive and kind of making these bold proclamations before he really knows the details and intricacies of what's going to happen, and then backtracking when the political winds seem to be pushing in a different direction. And I think the first big mistake he made was the fact that he commented on the issue of who he would appoint to Feinstein's seat 2 years before this situation of her passing even happened. So he had been asked on, national television if Feinstein were to resign due to her age or her mental acuity deteriorating, would you appoint a Black woman to her seat? And this was an issue because he had appointed Alex Padilla to replace Kamala Harris in the Senate when she became vice president. Padilla was the first Latino senator for California, but his appointment angered a lot of Black voters and Black women voters specifically because, with Harris leaving, that was basically, they felt that was such a historic election that needed to be carried on. And at the time, I believe there were no other Black women in the Senate. So they kind of felt like the governor didn't appreciate the significance of that. And so on the TV show, he says, yes, I have multiple names in mind, and I am going to appoint a Black woman. That backfired because people basically said, well, if you actually wanted to appoint a Black woman, you could have already done it. There was already an opening for you to do it. And he was also facing a recall election at the time. And so a lot of people perceived that as kind of a cynical attempt to, try to win back the vote and appreciation of Black women voters who are among the most loyal voters for the Democratic Party. So I just don't think he should have even said anything at that point. Don't make a promise that you might not even have to weigh in on. It's going to backfire. Other people felt that it was disrespectful to Feinstein because he had already had an appointment, and here he is talking about who he's going to appoint for the second seat. And then just a couple of weeks before Feinstein passed, they asked him again about this potential appointment. And he said, well, I'm only going to appoint someone as an interim appointment, suggesting that he intended that any person that took that seat would not run again in 2024 because he didn't want to, sway that election. Well, that also backfired because there is actually a Black woman running in the Senate race already, Barbara Lee, a congresswoman, and she and a lot of her supporters and just people in general kind of found it patronizing that the governor would essentially say, well, yes, I am going to appoint a Black woman, but only as a placeholder, essentially, until the 2024 election. And I'm not going to choose a Black woman who's already in the race and has already been running. And then I think he realized how bad that looked to basically be putting these conditions on a female candidate, just telling them, oh, you can't run because I don't want to screw up the election or influence the election. And so then he backtracked on that and was like, well, no, they actually can run. And then, when he picked LaFonza Butler, I think, separately from her qualifications, of which she has many, and I think that he threaded the needle of his various constituencies and desires with that appointment very well in picking her. It also landed a bit flat in some quarters and opened him up to criticism because she lived in Maryland at the time and had lived there for 2 years and was not actually registered to vote in California. That has changed since, but it didn't seem like his office was very transparent about that until people started realizing, online finding records of registrations and voter registrations and things like that she was living in Maryland. And so I think that he could have avoided that by being transparent from day one. But then again, they had to kind of play catch up and they had to fight back all these critiques from people saying, well, now you've appointed the third senator of Maryland. So she has a long history of living in California. She's back in LA, I think, where she already has a home. But these are just political mistakes that I think very easily could have been avoided if he didn't really say anything until the moment came for him to make a decision. And then when he did make that decision, he was very transparent about all the different aspects of that appointment.
So staying on the topic of Governor Newsom, he's preparing for his upcoming debate with Governor Ron DeSantis on Sean Hannity's show. So Newsom is seemingly everywhere on television these days, doing spin at the GOP debate, traveling to New York for Climate Week. What do you make of his political positioning these days? Is he just an enthusiastic cheerleader for the Democratic cause, or is he a Democratic presidential candidate in waiting?
Well, I think he continues to insist that he's the former. And I think that he might be the former, but he also might be the latter at the same time. I mean, look, like the governor is clearly very ambitious. He likes the spotlight, and that's part of the reason why he got in the whole problem with the Senate appointment, was because he couldn't hold himself back from, making these comments, making these promises, going on these national TV shows, opening himself up to all these points. And it's hard for me to envision any other job he could have in the future that would satisfy that ambition that is not running for president. And, I think it's quite possible that he holds off until a cycle where it makes sense. He has repeatedly said that he won't run against Biden, and I do believe him on that. If something were to happen that causes Biden not to run or something like that, I think things could change. But I do see at least in the next couple of cycles, I think he will make a bid. And I think that's kind of what he's been setting himself up for. I mean, he's been pushing himself as the forefront of the Democratic Party. He makes comments all the time like, buck up, Democrats, or wake up, America, and essentially sending the message that he's going to be the one to buck up the party. He's going to be the one to wake up America. He's going to China pretty soon to talk about climate agreements with China. That's something that is a very big stage. It's an international stage. He has introduced this constitutional convention amendment to try to get the country to, agree on gun control, which probably is not going to happen. But I think if he was really just focused on being governor, leading the state, I don't think he would be taunting DeSantis in the way that he is, agreeing to, and, having this debate with him. I don't think he would be going on these red state tours where he's gone numerous times to, yes, he's there to kind of sell the message of Democrats, but he's also there to sell himself as a Democrat and as the Democrat in the future. So, I really don't think that he's doing all of this just for kicks. I do think that he is positioning himself for something in the future. And I also think that we're seeing that in some of the decisions that he's been making politically. I mean, I had an article about some of the bills that he's signed and vetoed, and I think that he's sent a somewhat moderate stance with a lot of the bills that he's been vetoing, including a bill that would have decriminalized psychedelic drugs, would have given workers on strike unemployment benefits, and would have basically required human drivers to be in self-driving trucks. And those are signs that he is tacking towards the middle and wanting to send messages that are palatable not only to voters in California, but voters across the country.
So homelessness, unfortunately, continues to dominate both the policy and the political landscape of San Francisco. Earlier this summer, you saw Governor Newsom infamously say that he wants San Francisco to, quote, enforce the damn laws. But lately, you're seeing the battle move from the state capitol and city hall to the courtroom. Now, it seems like city voters and even many very progressive voters are increasingly frustrated and tired of the inaction. So from your vantage point, what do you think it's going to take to finally see some progress made in getting homeless off the street in San Francisco? And do you think this current crop of officials that are leading the city could actually turn things around? And maybe more importantly, we should be asking what sorts of policy changes are even possible within the current kind of political makeup of the city?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and one that obviously officials have been grappling with for a long time. I think the courtroom aspect that you hinted at is very interesting because everyone right now seems to be focused on this Ninth Circuit ruling that basically has been interpreted to mean that cities cannot sweep homeless encampments unless there is a shelter bed for every homeless person to go into. And this is something that Newsom, San Francisco Mayor London Breed, and a lot of other Democrats have been increasingly vocal as basically accusing the courts of hamstringing their ability to address homelessness. I think there's a debate about the way in which that ruling should be interpreted and what makes sense logically. But I also think that those types of comments are a bit of a way to deflect the blame for homelessness from themselves onto the court. And I mean, who knows who the courts will blame, right? Like, you can always find someone else to blame for the problems that exist in a community. I think homelessness is so complex because there's there's a group of people that, really firmly believe that the best way to address homelessness is just, you build a ton of housing, you put people in the housing, and you deal with their potential behavioral health issues and substance abuse issues once they're in the housing. And it's not really effective to treat them on the streets because they're on the streets, and so nothing's really going to stick or work. And then there's another sort of faction of people that are arguing that, well, you need to make sure that people are getting treatment first and then are basically stabilized enough to go into housing and, be able to live on their own in that housing. And I think that oftentimes what I find in California is that there's always nuance missing in these debates where we don't need to go 100% with one policy or 100% with another policy. I sort of feel like we need something of everything to make it work because there are people who could thrive or get better, I think, under both circumstances. But if you are only focused on one of them, you're going to miss entire segments of the population. And it's complicated because one part is, cities are not building enough housing to house all the people that are here. There is not enough housing that is affordable for people to move into. I actually was just visiting a single room occupancy hotel in San Francisco, and I was talking with a man there who said he's lived there since the 1980s, and I think he pays like $400-$500 a month for this SRO room, and it's in kind of a gritty part of San Francisco. And he was saying that he kept saving and wanted to be able to move out of the SRO into like his own apartment. And every time he thought he had saved enough money, he would look at the prices of the apartments and realize that they had increased faster than he'd been able to save his money. And he's like a retired postal worker. And, hearing that story, I was just like, oh, it kind of brought home for me the fact that there are many, many working people who cannot afford to live in the cities where they're working. And we need them to be able to because they are performing essential functions for that community. So definitely one part of it is getting rid of the red tape, getting rid of the NIMBYism that blocks housing from being built where it needs to be built. And that includes shelters and things like that a lot of communities are opposed to. And then I think another part of it is being really honest about the intersection of homelessness and substance abuse and mental health, and how sometimes substance abuse issues can cause mental health issues. I mean, it's very clear that there are people that are, pushed onto the street and they are cycling in and out of homelessness and shelters and hospitals and jails and prisons, and they're never getting better. They're never able to stabilize. And I think a lot of people in the community are frustrated by what they see as, cities being, I guess, kind of lax in that situation and basically saying, well, we want you to get into treatment, but, you don't really have to. And we're going to maybe book you into jail, but then we're going to just release you a couple of hours later. And people do want to see accountability. They do want to see some level of responsibility from people. And I think that the state and the city, I think, are slowly realizing that and slowly moving in that direction. I mean, we have Care Court rolling out in 7 counties already. The governor's push to get more people into treatment and housing. That one is voluntary, but he did also just sign a bill to basically expand the amount of people who are eligible for conservatorship and can be compelled into treatment and housing. Again, for that to be successful, you're going to need to have more housing. You're going to need to have more facilities that treat people with mental health issues at all levels of care, from locked facilities down to unlocked facilities. You're going to need more behavioral health workers. So there's a lot of problems there. And those workers are going to need to be able to afford to live in the areas where they're working. And then you have in San Francisco, you have new policies coming out from the mayor and from the DA that are trying to crack down on both users and sellers of drugs and which are, keeping people from improving. And so, but yeah, it is this complexity where it's like, how much of it is the drug and the mental illness versus the affordability thing, or all these things compounding. And so I think what often happens in California is you have a lot of top Democrats kind of waffle between different things depending on what people are saying at that point in time. And it'll just be interesting to see if we stay on the tack that we've been on, it seems like, the past couple of years, of kind of requiring more personal responsibility, more accountability than we have in the past, or if there's going to be a pushback that, there's infringements on civil liberties or punishing poverty, things like that.
PRI has documented how state environmental regulations hold up new housing construction and other critical priorities in our CEQA Gauntlet study, and how they add expense to these projects. So recently, we've seen incremental progress made in the legislature to reform state law to make it easier to build politically favored projects, such as more infill or more dense housing projects. Yet, despite these changes in the law, projects in San Francisco and other cities that make sense and have wide support continue to be blocked in the face of NIMBY opposition. So from what you're seeing in the ground in San Francisco, talking to NIMBY activists and government leaders, what do you think will it finally take to break the logjam and get some of these projects built? If changes in state law won't solve the problem, what do you think will?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, clearly the state could do more on its end. It has done things to tie local government's hands in terms of projects that they can refuse to build. It has more teeth on its housing mandates of the number of units that they need to build. But the state has not really embarked on a wholesale overhaul of CEQA that many people, including the editorial board at the Chronicle, have argued that it needs to. Former Governor Jerry Brown called reforming CEQA the Lord's work, and I don't think the Lord's work has really been finalized yet at the state level in terms of CEQA. But it's true that a lot of the opposition is happening at the local level, and despite the tougher laws that have been passed, we're still seeing local governments and neighborhood groups mobilize in opposition to new housing. And something that's been very interesting to watch from my perspective is the ways in which cities and neighborhood groups have actually been using pro-housing laws to deny or delay new housing. And as an example that I reported on that I found particularly interesting is basically a provision of law that requires fair housing policy, which basically is attempting to desegregate historically discriminatory and segregated communities by requiring affordable housing to be built in all communities, not just lower income communities that tend to be communities of color, or putting low income housing near freeways or other highly polluted areas. And we've actually seen numerous communities argue that the fair housing law is unconstitutional. And one community, La Cañada Flint Ridge in Los Angeles County, essentially said that the fair housing law violates the ruling that the Supreme Court issued that affirmative action is unconstitutional, which suggests that they're saying that building low income or affordable housing in areas that are not already like that is, I guess, discriminatory against people that live there, which tend to be wealthy or Asian and white communities, or predominantly white communities. And then we also have groups that are saying that if you are essentially, if you're building affordable housing in a wealthy area, people are challenging that, saying it should actually be built in even wealthier areas because otherwise it's not fair housing. So there's this weird interpretation of a fair housing law that is going on that is blocking projects that are much needed at the local level. And it's going to be interesting to see how the state responds to that, because honestly, the state has not enforced its own housing laws as aggressively as I think it should. And we've actually kind of seen the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, step into the housing space, which is typically overseen by the state housing department, and also start bringing lawsuits, start cracking down on communities that are refusing to build housing. But the state housing department, I mean, it has to oversee nearly 500 jurisdictions, and the conditions in each jurisdiction are so different. They have very different needs. They have very different politics going on, and trying to police all of their community planning meetings and approvals and disapprovals has proven very challenging. And so there are a lot of local YIMBY groups that are bringing lawsuits and flagging for the state when these communities are rejecting projects that should be approved. But I do think it's going to take even more, I guess, aggression from the state in terms of how it's policing its own laws, because there has been somewhat of a trend that we've observed of picking and choosing, where, it filed lawsuits against Huntington Beach because Huntington Beach is partially because Huntington Beach is, Republican majority led city that is very egregious in how it's flaunting state housing laws. But there are plenty of Democrat wealthy areas like Sausalito that have also been flaunting state housing laws, and Atherton and Woodside that the state has not gone after or cracked down on in nearly the same way. And so I think there really needs to be a uniformity and a very clear message that regardless of the type of city that you are, the politics of the people there, the donors, whatever it may be, we're going to ensure that you do your fair share and build the housing that you are required to build. And I think part of it is going to have to come from the local level. I mean, I do think that if homelessness keeps getting worse and we're seeing more and more people on the street, at a certain point, I would have to think that local governments are going to realize, okay, if we don't build housing, this crisis is going to get worse. And that's something that none of us want. And so at a certain point, we need to just bite the bullet and build the housing. And so I think at a certain point, they're going to have to make that realization. But again, it's just frustrating because it's always, finger pointing at each other about, who's not doing this or who's not doing this right. And, in Sacramento, for example, there's always so much fighting between the city and the county over homelessness and housing and all of this stuff. It's like, well, everyone should just do their part. But it's unfortunately never that simple.
So let's shift to crime. Many may not realize it, but Oakland's crime problem these days is perhaps worse than what's going on in San Francisco. And progressive District Attorney Pamela Price has faced sharp criticism from business owners and voters for what seems like an aversion to actually prosecuting people. And a recall campaign has popped up. So share with our listeners a little bit about this growing controversy over DA Price. And do you think what happened in San Francisco with the recall of the DA there could also happen in Alameda County with Pamela Price?
Yeah. So Pamela Price is the Alameda County District Attorney, and she's kind of part of this group of so-called progressive prosecutors that put an emphasis on rehabilitation over incarceration and have moved to reduce or do away with sentence enhancements altogether because they argue that, longer prison sentences, longer jail sentences do not reduce crime. And what is really needed is meaningful treatment and rehabilitation and reentry so people can go back into the community and not commit crimes anymore. And I think, so I recently went to a town hall that Price held in Fremont, which is my hometown. And I was just really curious to sort of see how she was going to present her vision to voters, how people in my hometown would react. And, I think my takeaway from that encounter was that on paper, I think the ideas that progressive prosecutors are saying sound really good. I think we would all, in general, prefer to see people get rehabilitated and reformed rather than, just throwing them into prison and locking the door and never caring about what happens next. I don't think most people would want that. The problem is that I feel that a lot of progressive prosecutors and progressive Democrats in general are putting forth these quasi-utopian visions for how society should work without actually putting into place the infrastructure and changes and investment that would be necessary to actually bring us closer to that sort of system in the first place. And so what they're doing is they're effectively tearing down an existing system, which is, of course, has its problems and is imperfect, but they're not really putting anything alternative in its place. And so what we have people who are committing crimes that I think many people would find to be serious, violent, concerning, and they're doing them repeatedly, and they are not necessarily being sentenced in the way that they would have been in the past. And they're not necessarily getting effectively rehabilitated when they're in jail or they're in prison, and then they're being released and people are feeling unsafe. And there has been an uptick in violent crime since 2020 in California. It's, many people will note that it's not as high as it used to be back in the 90s, and that is true, but it has gone up in recent years. And I think there's just more guns than ever in our communities. That's something that Price said as well. And so there is real reason why people feel concerned about, I think, some of the rhetoric that comes from progressive prosecutors like Price. Clearly, however, the voters elected her, and she was never unclear about the type of vision that she had for prosecution. But I think that once that starts going into effect and people start feeling like more attention and more emphasis is being placed on rehabilitating offenders rather than helping victims and protecting innocent people, that's when there starts to be this level of discontent that I think partially led to the recall of Boudin in San Francisco, and I think is, probably galvanizing the effort in Alameda County against Price. I think people are used to hearing from their prosecutor the idea that they're going to prosecute and they're going to, maybe as draconian as it sounds, put people behind bars. I think that's the vision people understand when it comes to prosecution. Obviously, with defense attorneys and public defenders, I think we're obviously used to hearing some of the things that people like Price are actually saying. And so I think it's confusing for a lot of people. And they didn't necessarily realize the effect that was going to have on how crimes were addressed. That being said, and Price pointed this out numerous times during the town hall, there's only so much that a prosecutor really affects. I mean, obviously her hands are tied by state laws, right? And the legislature and the governor are, changing those laws all the time about how long, sentences should be for certain crimes, which crimes are considered serious felonies, which ones are not, which crimes the judge has discretion to consider an enhancement for and not. So there's only so much effect that she is having. But I do think that amid this uptick in violent crime, amid this sense that our streets are becoming more and more lawless, there's more and more overt homelessness, more and more overt drug use. I think people are looking for a sense of order and a sense of decorum and a sense that people need to be held accountable for their actions. And if we want to focus on rehabilitation, that's wonderful, but they probably need to be rehabilitated in a more secure setting where we can make sure that that's actually happening. And so I think in general, I think the vision should be, let's reform the problems in our existing system because they definitely exist and we know about them, but let's just not tear it down and put nothing in its place and then pretend that everything's going to be fine, because it's not.
So, Emily, we saw a big flap this summer over bills authored by Republicans in the legislature dealing with the fentanyl crisis and human trafficking, blocked by liberals on the Assembly Public Safety Committee. So new Assembly Speaker Robert Rivas seems to be more of a pragmatist and political realist on these issues. What are your thoughts on what Speaker Rivas should do to ensure that reasonableness carries the day going forward on crime and the drug crisis?
It's definitely been interesting to see Rivas take over as Speaker, because he has already indicated that he plans to be a lot more hands-on and interventionist than his predecessor, Anthony Rendon, who was kind of notorious and well known for, not really taking a stance on bills and letting the chairs of the committees have a very big role in determining whether they would even consider a bill, let alone bring it up for a vote. And so, Rivas has kind of stepped in and he's made clear this past session how he feels about certain bills. So, for example, on the bill to make child trafficking a serious felony, it had been shot down by the committee, which was led by Assemblyman Reggie Jones-Sawyer of Los Angeles. And after there was a lot of blowback surrounding them killing that bill, Rivas stepped in, the governor stepped in. They essentially were like, no, we need to find some kind of solution for this. And then lo and behold, the bill gets back through the committee. They have another hearing. It clears the legislature. A ton of Democrats sign on as co-authors. It goes to the governor signs it. So, that was a very abrupt about face for that bill. And Rivas is interesting because he is a progressive lawmaker, I would say, in many ways. He has a lot of progressive priorities. It looks like he's going to be steering the ship with a bit of a firmer hand. And I do think that will help the legislature advance more common sense legislation, because I think Rivas wants to avoid the bad PR that happened with the Jones-Sawyer decision on the fentanyl bills and on the child trafficking bill, where you're essentially having one person say, I don't like this bill, and therefore I'm not going to let it even come up for a vote. I'm not even going to allow debate on it, which is what he did for the fentanyl bills originally, not even going to have hearings on these bills. I think everyone just wants to have their day in court, as it were, to talk about the merits of their bill, have debate debate. That's part of a democracy. And, I've talked with a lot of former Democratic speakers of the Assembly who essentially said to me, like, every bill should come up for a vote. I mean, that's the reason they're introduced. Let people make their case. And if you want to vote it down, vote it down. But there needs to be a democratic process. And I think Rivas has indicated that he wants to do that. I also think another way that he could kind of keep the legislature in line is to be more aggressive in limiting the number of bills that they introduce. Right now, there's thousands of bills that get introduced every year, hundreds, if not more than 1,000 to get to the governor's desk. And I'm hard pressed to argue that we really need 1,000 new laws every single year in California. I think we need to be judicious about the type of legislation that we're introducing and introduce legislation that actually means something and has impact rather than something that's kind of there just to like make a political point or to regulate like the kind of the most crazy of things. One example that I got from former Democratic Assembly Speaker Fabian Nunez was that people were regulating that if a horse gets pregnant in Oregon and like the calf of the horse is brought to, I guess the foal is brought to California, is it do you regulate it under California laws or Oregon laws? They were trying to regulate the clipping of birds' feathers, and it may very well be that we do need to regulate those things. But I think his point was that we are so tied up on these little things that don't really matter that we're not actually addressing like the big issues. And I think another great example of that was the fact of the homeowners insurance crisis here in California. Following all the wildfires, homeowners insurers are pulling out of the state like crazy or reducing their coverage. More and more people are having to go on to the insurer of last resort, which could very well go bankrupt. And that's a huge crisis. But the lawmakers didn't even pass legislation on it this entire session. They were focused on other things. Some of them are critically important. Others were not so important. And to me, I sense that there's not always a desire among lawmakers to tackle those issues that maybe are like less sexy and play less well with, constituents, but at the same time are so critically important to the functioning of the state. And so I think Rivas could really help to set a firm agenda for his caucus and for the Assembly in general, and kind of keep people on track so they don't get sidetracked with pet projects or random things that don't really matter that much, but are instead really focused on the critical issues of the state. And hopefully that will also help bring people together, like Republicans and Democrats, and we can have more bipartisan bills that are really focused on consensus and applicable solutions.
So at PRI's Free City Center, we cover the debate over transportation funding and transportation policy quite a bit. And this year, funding for public transportation agencies like BART was at the center of the state budget debate. And even though the reform of BART is obviously needed to turn around this troubled agency, they still received another state bailout, and BART board members even refused to draw up a list of potential cuts. So as a self-professed BART superfan, what do you think is needed to turn the system around and encourage people to actually start riding the train again?
Yeah, well, I am a BART superfan. I also, because I love BART, I've also been, critical of some of the conditions on BART, especially in recent years. So I think the future of BART is honestly tied a lot to the future of the Bay Area. And again, it's going back to these issues of homelessness and crime and mental illness, because those are the things that surveys have shown over and over and over again are preventing riders from going back on BART and other public transit, especially now that they don't necessarily have to as much with the rise of remote work. And it's unfortunate because at the end of the day, BART is a transportation provider and it really should not have to be in the social services business. That's not what it was designed to do. But I do think that it's going to have to come up with more effective ways of handling those issues in conjunction with the authorities so that people are returning to those systems. And BART has been putting a lot of emphasis on these new fare gates that it's going to start rolling out in December. And those are basically going to make it significantly harder, that's the hope, for people to just jump the fare gates without paying and go on to BART. And there is police data showing that the most common infraction that police officers are called on by riders is tied to people that don't pay their fares. So I think it's smart of BART to focus on that issue. And thankfully, the governor just vetoed a bill that would have decriminalized fare evasion, which actually the BART board also opposed. So I think that's a recognition that no, you need to pay your way onto BART and do your part to help take care of the system. And so I think that will help keep some of the people that are causing problems on BART off of the train. But then I also think it is incumbent on BART to realize that it itself is part of the problem. I have really never seen people go on BART and like clean the trains. BART is saying that they have a lot more police, they have a lot more ambassadors on the train to help people that are in crisis. But I've been on cars where people were in crisis or were homeless and were like laying across multiple seats and deterring riders. But those people refused services, and the ambassadors kept moving on. I'm not sure if they could have done anything anyway, but I think the point is that there's still going to be people that are on the train that are causing problems, and so how do you effectively address that once they're actually on the train? And then there's also just the issue of the stations, and they're not clean, they're not generally pleasant places to be in. And I just find it unfortunate because, I've ridden transit systems in many other places in the world, and they're all better. They're all better than they are in California. They're all better than they are in one of the richest places in the richest country in the world. And I find that very ironic. And I just think that we as a country and as a state need to take more pride in our public facilities and our public infrastructure, because I do think, many people don't care if they trash it. They don't care if they don't pay. They don't care if they, are smoking something on the car or playing their music super loud and, dropping trash everywhere. Like, that's not something that you see as much, if at all, in other countries. And there just needs to be a kind of I think a cultural shift in how people think about these systems. And we need to make clear that these are things that we should take pride in it. And so that means that we should have good service and not just be satisfied with something that gets us from point A to point B, but does so 10 minutes late. And when you get there, you want to take a shower because you feel like it was really dirty. And, you had to avoid someone who is acting erratically. Like, it shouldn't be like that. And so I do think BART's going to need to do some soul searching on that. They're going to have to ask themselves some tough questions, especially as money runs out. And they're going to have to go to the voters to ask for more. So I think if they're going to do that and they want to get approved, they definitely need to show improvement, because I do think voters are at a point where they're like, why would I fund a system that's never getting better? So there does need to be accountability. There does need to be improvement, and there are going to have to be tough choices. And that's just the reality.
Emily, as we close, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy while enjoying a glass of California wine. So what wine, beer, or cocktail, or other beverage do you enjoy at the end of your busy day after churning out another thought-provoking column?
Well, I was laughing trying to think of an answer to this. I mostly just drink water. Like, that's super boring, but that's the case. But periodically, if I am going to have like a nice fancy beverage, I definitely prefer wine. And I'm not super picky on the type of wine that it is, but I have been obsessed recently with like Sauvignon Blanc, which I think is really good, and it's refreshing. So I think that, especially during this hot summer that we've had, I feel like that's been my go-to when I am partaking in the delicious wine of our state.
Finally, Emily, for our listeners who want to read your column and follow you on social media, what do they need to do to subscribe and keep track of what you're doing?
Thank you. Yeah, so my work is all available at sfchronicle.com, and you can find my work and that of the editorial board, which I'm also a member of, in the opinion section of the SF Chronicle. You can also find my work on Twitter, now known as X, and I share all of my columns, including links that allow you to go past the paywall. Although we would, of course, love if you subscribe to the Chronicle and help pay to keep local journalism alive. My Twitter handle is Emily _Hoeven, Hoeven, and definitely give us a look. And I really appreciate both of you taking the time to talk with me today about these issues.
Thanks so much, Emily. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.